Welcome to Hidden Chapters. If it wasn't written down, it wasn't supposed to be remembered. This is one of those stories. I finished the mission. Then I heard the voicemail. The first missed call came during a briefing. I remember that clearly because my phone vibrated once, softly, before the signal dropped completely. No alert. No follow-up. Just a brief interruption before the room pulled my attention back where it belonged. Communications were unreliable in that region. Everyone knew it. Messages arrived late, out of order, or not at all. Anything urgent would come through official channels. Anything personal could wait. That's how we survived deployments. By trusting the system to filter what mattered. I silenced the phone without looking at the screen. The mission was entering its final phase, an advisory operation with local forces that had taken weeks to stabilize. No direct engagement. No headlines. Just presence, planning, and patience. The kind of work that doesn't look dramatic but determines what happens months later. Focus mattered. Distraction didn't. Another vibration came later that night, brief and incomplete. Again, no signal. No message preview. I told myself I'd check when coverage returned. I always did. By morning, the phone was quiet again. The days blurred into routine. Planning sessions. Movement checks. Long stretches of waiting punctuated by moments that required absolute clarity. Every decision carried weight, even the small ones. That kind of pressure narrows your world until only the mission exists. That's what training does. It teaches you to compartmentalize. Somewhere outside that compartment, life continued without me. I knew that in theory. I'd accepted it years earlier. My family understood the rules as well as I did. Emergencies would be escalated. Silence usually meant everything was fine. Usually. On the third day, communications briefly stabilized. Messages arrived all at once, outdated news updates, routine check-ins, nothing urgent. No voicemail alerts. No missed call notifications. I didn't question it. We completed the final advisory review that afternoon. Local command signed off. Objectives met. The operation would be logged as successful, quiet, exactly as intended. That night, I slept without interruption. The mission ended the next morning. Extraction was clean. Equipment packed. Debriefing scheduled. As we lifted away, the region below shrinking into something manageable again, I felt the familiar release that comes when responsibility loosens its grip. Only then did my phone reconnect fully. It vibrated hard enough to startle me. 4 missed calls. All from the same number. Home. The voicemail icon blinked once, then again. I didn't listen right away. That's something people don't talk about, the hesitation. The instinct to delay information you're not prepared to carry yet. I told myself it could be anything. A technical error. A misunderstanding. A message left in panic and resolved minutes later. I stepped away from the others and pressed play. My wife's voice came through thin and distorted, like it had traveled too far to reach me intact. She said my name once. Then she said our son's. Then she paused. That pause lasted longer than the rest of the message combined. I didn't hear the rest clearly. Just fragments. An accident. A hospital. A decision that couldn't wait. The message ended abruptly. I stood there listening to the silence that followed, realizing something I hadn't understood until that moment. The mission hadn't protected me from what was happening at home. It had only delayed the moment I'd be forced to face it. And whatever decision had been needed, it had already been made without me. I replayed the voicemail 3 times before I moved. Not because I expected it to change, but because my mind needed time to catch up with reality. The words didn't rearrange themselves. The pauses didn't shorten. Each replay confirmed the same truth from a slightly different angle. I had been unavailable when availability mattered most. I tried calling back immediately. The call didn't connect. Then it did, long enough to ring twice before dropping. Coverage was still unstable, and I hated how familiar that excuse felt now. Extraction procedures continued around me. Paperwork. Accountability checks. Quiet jokes about getting real coffee again. The world behaved as if nothing had shifted, and I moved through it on instinct alone. I asked for a secure line. Protocol required justification. I gave it. Not the full truth, just enough to be understood. Family emergency. Medical. Time sensitive. The words felt thin, like placeholders for something heavier. When the connection finally held, my wife answered without saying hello. Her voice sounded older than it had days before. He'd been riding with friends. Nothing reckless. Nothing unusual. A normal afternoon that ended wrong in a way no one plans for. The impact wasn't immediate. The consequences were. They'd asked for consent. Procedures. Options. Risks. The kind of conversation that assumes someone is available to answer. She told them I was deployed. They waited longer than they should have. Then they couldn't wait anymore. I listened without interrupting. That's another habit you learn, absorbing information without reacting, cataloging details as if they belong to someone else. It buys you time, but it doesn't change outcomes. She said they made the call they thought I would have made. That hurt more than the accident itself. Not because it was wrong. Because it meant they'd already learned how to live without my input. I asked questions anyway. About timelines. About procedures. About recovery. Practical things that could still be influenced. Some answers helped. Others closed doors quietly. By the time the call ended, the mission debrief was already underway. I attended out of obligation, not presence. I spoke when required. I nodded at the right moments. The operation was praised for restraint and effectiveness. Objectives achieved. Partnership strengthened. No one asked how I was doing. They didn't need to. Afterward, alone, I stared at the phone in my hand like it was evidence of something I'd failed to safeguard. I'd trusted systems my entire career, chains of command, escalation protocols, emergency filters. They had worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. Nothing had broken. Nothing had malfunctioned. The system had simply decided my attention was better used elsewhere. And I had agreed with that decision every day I wore the uniform. Until now. I thought about the missed calls again, not as alerts, but as moments. Each ring representing a chance to step out of the compartment I'd built so carefully. Each one unanswered not because I didn't care, but because caring had been scheduled for later. Later had arrived too late. I packed my gear methodically, hands moving while my thoughts stayed elsewhere. There was nothing to fix in the field now. No decision left to make. Only consequences to absorb. On the flight home, surrounded by people who'd shared the same mission but not the same cost, I finally allowed myself to feel something close to panic. Not fear of what had happened. Fear of what might come next. Because I realized something then that training never prepares you for. You can succeed completely at the mission and still fail somewhere that matters more. And no after-action report will ever record that part. The time between those rings, the minutes I'd given to duty without question, had already rewritten my role at home. I was returning not as the decision-maker, but as the one who had to live with a decision made in his absence. The flight felt longer than any deployment I'd ever done. Not because of distance, but because there was nothing left to distract me. No mission updates. No planning sessions. No reason to compartmentalize. Just time, the one thing I'd told myself I never had. I watched the cabin lights dim and thought about how often I'd used the same excuse at home. Just a little more time. Just one more phase. Then I'll be present again. The words sounded hollow now. I replayed the call in my head, not the facts but the tone. The way my wife's voice shifted when she said they'd made the decision. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Certain. She hadn't needed permission in the end. That realization settled deeper than the fear. It meant the system at home had adapted the same way the system in the field always does, by functioning without the part that wasn't available. I wondered what my son remembered from that day. Whether he'd asked for me. Whether anyone had told him I was on a mission, that I'd call as soon as I could. Or whether the urgency of the moment had pushed my name out of the room entirely. Hospitals don't wait for explanations. Neither does time. When we landed, the airport felt unreal. Too normal. Too loud. People moving with no awareness of how fragile their routines were. I moved through them like I didn't belong there anymore. I checked my phone again. No new messages. That silence felt heavier than the missed calls. The drive to the hospital passed in fragments. Red lights. Empty intersections. Familiar streets I'd memorized years ago but hadn't really seen since. Everything looked the same. That was the problem. I parked without remembering how I got there. Inside, the smell hit me first, antiseptic, recycled air, something sharp beneath it. A nurse asked my name. Then my son's. Her expression changed slightly, just enough to tell me what kind of night it had been. They led me down a hallway I didn't remember walking before. My wife was already there. She looked tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. When she saw me, she didn't rush forward. She didn't cry. She just nodded once, like she was confirming something. "You're here," she said. Not, "I'm glad you're back." Just confirmation. My son was unconscious, monitors marking time where words couldn't. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing language that balanced honesty with possibility. I listened like I always had, steady, controlled, asking the right questions. But this time, the questions felt hollow. Because the decision that mattered most had already been made. Consent forms signed. Procedures completed. Risks accepted. All without my voice in the room. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd been exactly where I was supposed to be. That truth didn't comfort me. It accused me. I stood there, watching my son breathe, and realized something I hadn't considered before. Being absent doesn't mean you're forgiven. It just means the world learns how to move on without waiting for you. The mission had ended successfully. But standing in that hospital room, it was impossible not to feel like I'd arrived too late to the only place where success actually mattered. And no amount of service would rewrite that timing. I reached for my son's hand, careful not to disturb the lines attached to him, and felt the weight of every unanswered call settle fully into place. This wasn't a moment I could fix. It was one I had to live with. And the hardest part wasn't what had happened. It was knowing that, for once, duty hadn't protected anyone. It had only protected the mission. The doctor spoke again the next morning. I recognized the cadence immediately, calm, precise, trained to deliver information without adding weight to it. The kind of voice that assumes someone is ready to hear whatever comes next. I wasn't. He explained the procedure they'd performed while I was unreachable. Why waiting would have increased the risk. How the window for consent had been measured in minutes, not hours. How they'd followed protocol when the legal guardian couldn't be contacted. Every word made sense. That didn't make it easier. My wife stood beside me, listening without interrupting. She already knew all of this. She'd lived it while I was still focused on timelines and objectives thousands of kilometers away. I watched her nod at the right moments, ask the questions I would have asked, sign where I would have signed. She hadn't hesitated. That's what unsettled me most. Not because she'd acted without me, but because she'd learned to. Later, when we were alone, she told me about the hours between the accident and the procedure. The waiting room. The calls that didn't connect. The decision that kept moving closer until it was the only one left. She said she thought about what I'd choose. Then she chose it. There was no resentment in her voice. No accusation. Just fact. She hadn't needed reassurance. She'd needed certainty, and in that moment, certainty didn't come from me. I tried to say thank you. The words didn't land. Our son woke briefly that afternoon. Not fully aware, but enough to squeeze my hand when I spoke his name. That small movement felt heavier than any medal I'd ever been handed. Proof that something still connected us across the gap my absence had carved. But even then, I knew. This wasn't over. Recovery would take time. Questions would come later, the kind that don't have answers you can file away neatly. And somewhere in those questions would live the truth we weren't saying out loud yet. I hadn't been there when it mattered. I stayed at the hospital that night, sitting in a chair that was never meant to be slept in. Machines hummed softly, measuring things I couldn't influence. I stared at the floor and thought about all the times I'd told myself I was doing this for my family. Providing. Protecting. Serving. Those words had always felt solid before. Now they felt conditional. At some point, exhaustion took over. I dreamed of radios that wouldn't connect, of phones ringing in empty rooms. I woke with the same realization waiting for me: the decision was done, and no amount of reflection would change it. In the days that followed, the hospital became routine. Progress charts. Care schedules. Controlled optimism. I learned the names of nurses. The layout of hallways. The rhythm of a place where waiting is the primary occupation. And slowly, another understanding set in. My role hadn't vanished. It had shifted. I wasn't the authority anymore. I was the support. The presence that arrived after the fact and stayed. The one who had to accept that sometimes, showing up late still means showing up. But acceptance isn't the same as peace. Because every time I looked at my son, breathing steadily now, I knew the truth that would follow us long after the hospital faded into memory. The mission hadn't taken my voice away. I had given it up, trusting a system to decide when it mattered. And that trust had cost me the one decision I will never get back. Recovery doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in increments small enough to miss if you're not paying attention. A finger moving. A sentence completed without effort. A laugh that sounds almost like it used to. We celebrated those moments quietly, careful not to name expectations we couldn't guarantee. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. That phrase followed us everywhere. It meant progress without promises. Improvement without certainty. I understood it well. It was the same language we used in the field when outcomes depended on time more than intent. Time became the enemy again. Rehabilitation schedules replaced mission timelines. Appointments replaced briefings. I learned how to wait without pretending it was temporary. My presence mattered now in a way it hadn't before, not as authority, but as consistency. My son noticed the change before I did. "You're not leaving," he said one afternoon, not as a question. I told him I wasn't. That answer felt heavier than any commitment I'd ever made. At night, when the hospital finally quieted, I replayed the accident in my head, not the event itself, but the hours surrounding it. The moments when my phone had vibrated uselessly in my pocket. The choice to silence it. The belief that urgency would announce itself clearly if it mattered. Urgency rarely does. It disguises itself as inconvenience, interruption, something that can be dealt with later. I'd been trained to filter those things out. To prioritize the mission over everything else. That training had worked. That was the problem. Friends and colleagues reached out once word spread. They spoke carefully, offering support without questions. They praised the mission. Told me how well things had gone, how important the outcome was. I thanked them. Then I wondered whether any of them understood the cost of praise. Because success had arrived on time. I hadn't. When my son was discharged, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Every sound registered. Every movement pulled my attention back. I found myself listening the way I did on patrol, alert to details I'd ignored for years. My wife noticed too. We didn't talk about it directly. We didn't need to. Absence teaches people how to adapt, but presence requires renegotiation. We were learning how to share space again without assuming roles that no longer fit. One evening, my son asked me about the mission. Not details. Not danger. Just why I'd been gone. I told him the truth, the kind shaped for someone his age, stripped of justification. I said I'd thought I was doing the right thing. That I believed everything important would wait. He nodded, then looked away. I needed you to answer, he said quietly. That sentence settled deeper than any reprimand. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. In that moment, I understood the final cost of the voicemail I'd heard too late. It wasn't the procedure. It wasn't the recovery. It was the knowledge that my absence had required someone else to become the decision-maker in my place, and that my son had noticed. I stayed with that realization longer than was comfortable. Because some lessons don't come from failure. They come from succeeding exactly as planned, and realizing the plan never accounted for what you couldn't afford to lose. I returned to work slowly. Not because I wasn't cleared, but because I didn't trust myself to move at the same pace as before. The world had shifted, and I needed to understand where I stood inside it before pretending nothing had changed. The first briefing back felt familiar in all the wrong ways. The language hadn't evolved. The assumptions hadn't softened. Missions were still framed as clean lines between start and finish, success and failure. No one mentioned what happens outside those lines. I listened, nodded, contributed when necessary. On the surface, I fit back in perfectly. That's the danger of experience, it lets you perform competence even when something inside you has fractured. Between meetings, I checked my phone more often than I ever had in the field. Not out of panic, but awareness. Every vibration mattered now. Every silence carried meaning. At home, the rhythm was different. My son was healing, but healing doesn't mean forgetting. He moved carefully, measuring his body the way I'd once measured terrain, testing limits, pulling back when something didn't feel right. I recognized the behavior immediately. It came from fear. Not of pain. Of being left again. That realization hurt more than anything the doctors had said. One night, while he slept, I sat alone in the kitchen and thought about all the absences I'd justified over the years. Birthdays missed. Calls postponed. Conversations shortened because something else needed attention. I'd told myself it was temporary. It never was. Temporary absences accumulate. They form patterns. And patterns teach people what to expect from you. The accident hadn't created the distance. It had exposed it. My wife and I finally talked openly then, not about blame, but about reality. About how she'd learned to operate without waiting. How she'd become the constant because I couldn't be. She didn't ask me to change. That was the hardest part. She simply told me what she'd carried alone while I was gone. And I realized that duty doesn't just take you away from danger. It takes you away from presence. The system doesn't care what it costs you personally. It only asks whether you can still function. And I had, right up until the moment when functioning wasn't enough. I looked at my calendar differently after that. Not as a schedule, but as a series of choices. Each commitment meant absence somewhere else. Each silence taught someone what mattered more. That awareness didn't make decisions easier. It made them heavier. Because now I knew there was no neutral choice. No option without consequence. Just different costs paid in different places. I still believed in service. I still believed in responsibility beyond myself. But I no longer believed those things excused absence without question. The voicemail hadn't changed who I was. It had clarified it. And clarity doesn't let you go back to ignorance. I stood in my son's doorway that night, watching him sleep, and understood something I hadn't during all those years away. Being present isn't about proximity. It's about availability. And the space I'd left behind, the space where decisions had been made without me, would always remind me of that difference. From then on, every mission came with a second briefing in my mind. Not about terrain or objectives. But about what I was choosing to leave unattended again. And whether I was finally ready to answer when it mattered. The next deployment request came sooner than I expected. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't dramatic. Just another rotation, framed as necessary, manageable, familiar. The kind of assignment I would have accepted without hesitation a year earlier. This time, I didn't answer right away. I read the details slowly, not for operational risk, but for absence. How long I'd be gone. How often contact would be unreliable. How many decisions at home would move forward without me if something went wrong again. Those questions hadn't existed in my calculations before. At home, my son was back at school on a modified schedule. He pretended everything was normal, but I noticed the pauses, the way he looked up when a door closed, the way his phone never left his hand. Trauma doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits. One evening, he asked me if I was leaving again. Not accusing. Not afraid. Just checking. I told him the truth. That I'd been asked. That I hadn't decided yet. He nodded and said nothing else. That silence told me more than any argument could have. I talked with my wife later that night. Not about permission, we were past that. About consequences. About what another absence would mean now, after everything that had happened. She didn't tell me what to do. She told me what it would cost. That clarity changed the shape of the decision completely. The system expects compliance because it assumes priority. It assumes service overrides context. But context is what turns duty into something human instead of mechanical. I requested a delay. That alone felt like crossing a line. The response was professional. Neutral. Slightly surprised. No pressure, but no reassurance either. Delays aren't forbidden, they're just remembered. I knew that. I accepted it. In the days that followed, I felt the weight of that choice settle in unfamiliar ways. Not relief. Not guilt. Responsibility of a different kind. The kind that doesn't come with recognition or explanation. I stayed. I took my son to appointments. I listened when he talked about things that had nothing to do with recovery. I learned the rhythm of being home without treating it as a temporary assignment. And slowly, something shifted. The vigilance in his eyes softened. The checking behavior faded. Presence did what reassurance never could, it rebuilt trust without needing words. I still thought about the mission I hadn't taken. About the people who would fill that role instead. About the work continuing without me, exactly as it always had. The world didn't pause. That was the final lesson. The mission would always go on. The system would adapt. Someone else would step in, do the job, succeed or fail within acceptable margins. But at home, there was no replacement. No rotation. No contingency plan. That understanding didn't weaken my sense of duty. It refined it. Service stopped being something I measured only by distance and risk. It became something I measured by what I was willing to miss, and what I wasn't. The voicemail had taught me that responsibility doesn't disappear when you're unavailable. It simply moves forward without you. This time, I chose not to let that happen again. Not because it was easier, but because some returns cost more than staying ever could. And I wasn't willing to pay that price twice. Silence feels different once you stop trusting it. Before, I treated it as confirmation, no news meant everything was under control. Now, silence felt like a question waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't rush to fill it, but I no longer ignored it either. Weeks passed without incident. That, too, required adjustment. Crisis sharpens attention, stability demands patience. I was learning how to exist without measuring days by urgency. At work, my role shifted subtly. I wasn't sidelined, but I wasn't central either. That used to bother me. Now it felt appropriate. I contributed where needed, stepped back where I wasn't essential. The system adjusted, just as it always does. At home, the adjustment went deeper. My son began talking again, not about the accident, but about everything around it. School. Friends. Small worries that had been swallowed by larger ones before. I listened without interrupting, resisting the urge to solve problems that didn't need solutions. Presence, I learned, isn't about intervention. It's about staying. One night, a storm knocked out power across the neighborhood. The house fell into darkness, the kind that makes familiar spaces feel uncertain. My son froze in the hallway, breathing shallow, waiting for something to happen. I was there. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood beside him until the tension eased. When the lights came back on, he looked at me like he'd just confirmed something important. Later, as I lay awake, I thought about how many moments like that I'd missed over the years, moments that never escalate into emergencies but still shape how people feel about safety. The mission never accounts for those. A message arrived from work the next morning. Another request. Another operation forming. This one smaller. Shorter. Manageable. I didn't answer immediately. I went home instead. I watched my son finish his homework at the kitchen table, his focus broken only by the occasional glance in my direction. Not checking. Just noticing. That was new. When I finally replied, I set boundaries. Clear availability windows. Communication expectations. Nothing dramatic. Just acknowledgement that absence now required negotiation, not assumption. The response came back slower than usual. Then it came back agreed. That surprised me. It shouldn't have. Systems resist change until someone insists on it calmly enough to make resistance inconvenient. I'd never tried before. That afternoon, I realized something else. The voicemail that arrived too late had done more than teach me a lesson. It had rewired my relationship with time. Urgency no longer dictated value. Presence did. Silence wasn't reassurance, it was something to be checked, understood, answered. I wasn't abandoning duty. I was redefining it. As the evening settled in, my phone rested on the table between us, untouched. Not ignored. Not feared. Just present, like I was trying to be. If it rang, I would answer. If it stayed silent, I wouldn't mistake that for safety. I'd learned the cost of that assumption. And this time, when silence arrived, I didn't let it pass unnoticed. I stayed with it. Because some calls don't announce themselves. They wait, hoping someone has finally learned to listen. I started noticing the change in smaller moments. Not in big decisions or dramatic gestures, but in how my body reacted before my mind did. When my phone vibrated, I no longer felt irritation. I felt attention. A quiet readiness that didn't rush, but didn't delay either. At work, people adjusted around that without comment. I was still reliable. Still precise. I just wasn't endlessly available anymore. The difference was subtle enough to go unnoticed by anyone who didn't know what to look for. And that was fine. One afternoon, reviewing operational plans, I realized something that would have unsettled me before. My name appeared less often on critical paths. Others were stepping into roles I'd once assumed were mine by default. The mission didn't suffer. It improved. That truth was uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. I had built part of my identity on being indispensable. Watching the system function without leaning on me as heavily forced a reckoning I'd avoided for years. At home, my son continued to heal in ways no chart could track. His movements became less cautious. His laughter returned without effort. But the most important change was invisible. He stopped checking whether I was nearby. He just assumed it. That assumption felt like trust being rebuilt, piece by piece, without ceremony. I didn't comment on it. I didn't name it. I let it grow on its own terms. One evening, we sat on the porch watching the light fade. He talked about school, about plans that reached further into the future than they had a few months ago. I listened, not because I had answers, but because listening had become the work. At some point, he asked me if I missed it. The deployments. The constant movement. The sense of being needed everywhere at once. I thought about it honestly. I miss parts of it, I said. But I don't miss what it took from me. He nodded, satisfied with that. Later, alone, I considered how close I'd come to losing this version of my life without realizing it. Not through failure or recklessness, but through success, by doing exactly what was expected of me for too long without questioning the cost. The voicemail hadn't changed the past. It had changed the future. I was still a soldier. Still capable. Still committed. But my definition of responsibility now included proximity, availability, and the willingness to interrupt myself when it mattered. Duty had expanded. It no longer ended at the edge of the mission. When another request arrived, this one unavoidable, I accepted it with conditions already in place. Clear communication. Defined limits. A return date that meant something. This time, I explained it at home before I left. My son listened, asked questions, and then did something he hadn't done before. He told me to call. Not if something went wrong. Just to call. That request stayed with me as I prepared to leave. Because it wasn't about fear. It was about connection. And I understood then that duty doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to be accountable, not just for outcomes in the field, but for the people who live with the space you leave behind. That was the kind of responsibility I was finally ready to carry. Not silently. Not later. But now. The last message didn't arrive during a crisis. That's what made it different. I was packing for a short deployment, nothing extended, nothing undefined. Clear timelines. Clear communication. The kind of mission that fits into a life instead of replacing it. My phone vibrated on the table. I looked at it immediately. Not because I was afraid of what it might contain, but because I'd learned that attention is a form of responsibility. Ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. It just postpones the moment you're forced to confront it. The message was simple. Call me when you can. No urgency. No alarm. Just presence on the other end. I stepped away and called back. My son answered. He didn't need anything specific. He just wanted to tell me about his day, a test he thought he did well on, a joke he'd heard at school, a plan he was already thinking about for the weekend. I listened. Not distracted. Not rushing. Just there. When we hung up, I realized something quietly profound. This was what answering looked like. Not rushing home in panic. Not arriving too late. Not carrying regret. Just staying connected in real time. The deployment went as planned. Communications dropped occasionally, but I compensated. I checked in when I could. I left messages when I couldn't. I no longer waited for urgency to justify contact. At home, life continued without holding its breath. That mattered. When I returned, there was no tension to dissolve, no distance to bridge. Just continuity. The sense that I'd been away without being gone. That distinction changed everything. The voicemail that arrived too late still exists. I haven't deleted it. Not because I need the reminder, but because it marks the point where something fundamental shifted. It wasn't the moment I failed. It was the moment I learned. Duty didn't stop being important. It became complete. I stopped measuring success only by objectives achieved and operations completed. I started measuring it by availability, by presence, by whether the people who mattered most could reach me when it counted. The system didn't punish that change. It adapted. Just like my family had. Looking back, I understand now that the real antagonist in this story wasn't the mission or the accident. It was time, and the illusion that you can always make things right later. Later is never guaranteed. The message that arrived too late taught me that responsibility doesn't wait for permission. But the message I answered proved something else. You can learn. You can adjust. And you can choose not to repeat the same silence twice. This hidden chapter doesn't end with regret. It ends with a decision made in time. And for the first time, that felt like success. Some stories don't end cleanly. If you want to hear the next hidden chapter, like the video and subscribe. And if you were the one who noticed first, what would you do with that responsibility?